Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this lunchtime Zoom seminar. My name is Bob Derenbacher, and it's my privilege to serve as the Dean of Trinity College Theological School. Today, we acknowledge the land on which Trinity College is located. It's the sovereign and unceded country of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, who have cared for this country since its creation. We commit ourselves to working for a more just settlement between Indigenous people and settlers. Just a couple of housekeeping matters before I turn it over to our moderator. Please keep yourself muted throughout the time today. So please ensure that your mute button has been clicked on. And also to let you know that this seminar is being recorded. And if you don't want your face on the recording, then please turn off your camera. It's my privilege now to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, the Reverend Dr. Chris Porter, who is our postdoctoral research fellow at Trinity College Theological School. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Bob. Welcome everyone again. Let me add my welcome to that of Bob's. Let me just do this. It is wonderful to have you all with us and for this seminar and for this what I wish could have been in person, but again we find ourselves over Zoom. In amongst our little group, we've just been talking about the travails of Zoom, but it is still a blessing to be able to meet and gather like this, even though we can't do so in person. Now, for this seminar, we have three friends. We have three friends of the Theological School. And I believe Zoom is just doing a little bit of odd things. So let's just force that. So we begin with Heather Cetrangolo, Reverend Heather Cetrangolo, who is I'll let them introduce themselves more fully, but who is a member of Trinity College in the Pathway School. Reverend Dr. Peter Carolane, who is a minister at Merri Anglican, and Reverend Dr. Alex Ross, who again is a minister at down Camberwell. But I'll ask them to introduce themselves now, and we'll get into discussing our topic at hand. So who wants to go first? Heather, I believe you're up.
Me to go first. Sorry, I didn't realize I was going to introduce myself. Hi, everybody. I'm Heather. I did study at Trinity when I was in training for ordination for 1 year due to a move that we made interstate for my husband's work 10 years ago. And I find myself working at Trinity as a chaplain with international students all these years later. So I'm a mum, I'm a wife, I'm an Anglican priest. I've been ordained just over 10 years, and I'm currently studying Franciscan pedagogy as my PhD topic. And my main passion at the moment is ecumenical theological formation and Franciscan history.
Peter, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Peter Carolane. I'm the minister at Merri Anglican based in Clifton Hill, and I'm married to Jo, and I've got two little boys, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I also my PhD history was in history in Australian colonial mission history.
Great. And Alex?
Thanks, Chris. Yes, I'm the vicar of East Malvern, not Camberwell. Chris, my predecessor is at Camberwell, so that's a sore point, particularly. But I'm the vicar of East Malvern with Glenn Huntley, itself a 19th century church plant of St Mary's Caulfield, and I've been here for about 2.5 years now. Before that, I was 4 years in the UK in Cambridge, where I did my PhD and was also in chaplaincy at Emmanuel College. I did my PhD in Anglican polity and particularly the place of metropolitical authority and provincial polity. Before that was back here in Melbourne for curacy, and did a sort of mixed formation for ministry, both at Trinity College for 3 years, and then 2 years at Ripon College, Cuddesdon in the UK. But other than that, I'm Melbourne born and bred.
Great. It's great to have all of you with us. And I hope this, for those of you watching on, this sort of exemplifies some of the breadth of Anglicanism. We have people from different parts of, not just parts of Melbourne, but people who have been trained in different areas and have different focuses, from chaplaincy through to church planting and traditional parish ministry, ministry as well, in different areas of the scope of Anglicanism. And for me personally, one of my big interests in this is that the way that Anglicanism has been engaged with over the past decades and even centuries has been in this scope of breadth that actually provides a great blessing to the church as a whole. And so what we wanted to do was to be able to have a conversation between the three participants, really thinking about how that breadth actually impacts on the church, but also not just on the church as a body, but as individuals within the church. And so one of my first experiences of Anglicanism, really the Church of England, was about seeing this breadth of liturgical formation and liturgical expression within the church. So I moved from a Congregationalist sort of model to being an Anglican, or being a church in the Church of England in the UK, and we had just this sudden explosion of different liturgical expressions. So I'm interested in your own reflections from the three of you about what your experience of the breadth of liturgical expression and practice has been.
I'm happy to go first. I grew up in Melbourne at St James, Ivanhoe, and my experience from birth was of I guess you'd call it a liturgical, low church, evangelical Anglican church. So we had we robed, we had choral services every week. I was the crucifer for many years. That was my life goal, to become the crucifer. When I was like 8 years old, I got to that life goal. And so that was the formation that I had probably up until my early 20s, that style of, church service, which embraced the historical Anglican traditions, but also, you'd have all the daggy stuff of the 1980s as well. The minister up the front with his robes playing the 12-string guitar and the puppet show. And all of that stuff was all part of what I grew up with as well. But then in my 20s, I moved to working at St Hilary's, which was at a very different style of church. This was in the 2000s. And it was more, very, very low church, no robes, no prayer book, or minimal prayer book at that stage. And this was with youth and young adults. So I got to experience that. And through that, I also got to work alongside the English Anglican ministry called Soul Survivor, which was huge in England. It was a big outreach ministry to youth that came out of an Anglican church in Watford, and very much very charismatic theologically, and thousands of kids and that sort of thing. So I got to experience that. And then more recently at Merri Creek, which is a church plant, although 8 years old now, I've sort of moved back sort of towards my roots, I think, a little bit more, and sort of found myself in an in-between place. So I guess it's still low church, but we've kind of returned to at least I've returned in my leadership to some of the traditions of the Anglican liturgy. So yeah, I feel, but then some of you might know my mum and dad, they're based at St Paul's Cathedral as well. And so very much entrenched in kind of the family in that sort of style of worship as well. Yeah.
For sure. Heather, Alex, your reflections?
Alex, go.
After you, Heather.
Oh, this is just taking me down memory lane. Yeah, I grew up in a, I guess, similar sort of church environment to Peter, although probably less evangelical, probably a little bit more on the progressive side theologically, but liturgically Anglo-Catholic. And I was very influenced by my experience of the Catholic Church that happened through school and friendships that I formed. And I actually met and married a Catholic boy who was working in a Catholic parish later in my 20s. So that's where I started. And it feels like such a long time ago, because God really took me on a journey of discovering the breadth of Anglicanism, but also really the breadth of the body of Christ. And in the last 15 years, it's been really, for me, a journey of experiencing so many different expressions of church, so many different liturgical expressions, so many different theologies and ecclesial structures. And that has been such an important part of my own journey and my own formation, and I think my own calling. But if I was to go back to when that started, which was really at St. Francis College in Brisbane. So I went to St. Francis College as a candidate for ordination. And St. Francis is, well, I don't know really what it is today, but back then, I guess it was a similar place to Trinity College. But what I found to be different about it is that something about the Brisbane diocese lent itself to the student body being extremely diverse. So the students that studied there had all come from completely different church experiences. Some were from the Anglican Church, and others had moved into the Anglican Church out of Pentecostalism or Catholicism or Orthodox church communities. And so for the first time in my life, in my early 20s, I actually experienced
I think occasionally Heather's Wi-Fi is dropping out. Hopefully she'll come back. But Alex, did you want to continue on? Oh, Heather's back. You go for it.
Oh, sorry. Did
That's
I
okay.
drop out? I was
Only
just
briefly.
talking to myself.
Just keep going.
Oh, and sorry, and the Wi-Fi is not very good here at the vicarage at St. Hilary's, so where we've just moved because my husband's just become the vicar. So same husband, he left the Catholic Church and became an Anglican minister. So so basically, St. Francis College was where I started to be challenged to expand my theological landscape and my spirituality. And at the time, it was both exciting and very confronting, and in some ways distressing almost for me, because I didn't realize until I was in that environment how shaped I was by Catholicism and by the Anglo-Catholic tradition, and how wed my experience of God was to those traditions. And something that progressively happened for me was that I guess my understanding of God's character and my understanding of church really expanded and shifted because of the people that I met in that space, and doing placements, you know, at the cathedral in Brisbane through to the Evangelical Church on the Gold Coast, which was less liturgical and more seeker sensitive, I suppose, and also the influence of connecting with charismatic movements for the first time. So that's a summary.
That sounds like a very broad education. Alex, what's been your experience?
Thanks, Chris. Well, I grew up in church-going family and in Melbourne, and there were two parishes which we attended when I was younger. Both of them broadly in the Catholic tradition. One was what we might call a kind of modern Catholic parish, and the other was very much a kind of conservative prayer book forward in faith sort of parish. And I must say I was sort of oblivious to to really the distinctions or what else there might be within Anglicanism at that age. And it was only really when I was at an undergrad at university, when I started to go to church for myself, sort of apart from the family, that I started to be a bit more self-conscious about what the tradition that I was formed in and was being formed in, and what other traditions there were, and what that tradition stood in contrast to. So that was a very formative time in my life. That was at St. Peter's Eastern Hill in the early 2000s. From that's where I discerned a call to ordination and went to Trinity College, which of course at that time too taught theology in an ecumenical environment, and so with Jesuits and the Uniting Church as well. And there was an element of ecumenical worship too, which we participated in, so came to understand a bit of those traditions. The other part of that formation, really, which was quite powerful, was the experience of placements, doing placements, and again, kind of mirroring my childhood. In a sense, I ended up going to a fairly sort of modern Catholic kind of parish, and also what was at that time a fairly kind of conservative prayer book kind of Anglo-Catholic parish. And I guess that provided an opportunity for me to kind of reflect a bit more consciously on those traditions. I wasn't a stranger to evangelicalism in Anglicanism, although it was never it was never a context that I'd known well. But I'd go along with friends who'd invite me from university to not necessarily Anglican, but kind of planet shakers, some of the big independent churches, and we go along occasionally to some of the sort of classic student evangelical churches in Melbourne, like St. Jude's Carlton, and I was very kind of interested in that tradition. But I must say, in terms of worship, in terms of liturgy, it was one that I could never, that simply never resonated with me particularly, certainly at that time. However, other things did, other aspects of that tradition, other aspects of that spirituality did, particularly preaching and attentiveness to the Bible, and I remember some wonderful Bible studies as well that the then principal of Ridley led, which I found most beneficial. When I went over to England to sort of, I'd always intended to do a kind of overseas stint, as it were, of formation in England, partly to see something of Anglicanism beyond just Melbourne, beyond just the Australian Church, partly to do some further study, and also partly to have an experience of residential formation, which no longer essentially sort of exists within Australia outside about Moore College. So have something of that kind of seminary experience, that sort of classical seminary experience. Ended up going to Oxford, where there are sort of three colleges essentially there. There's the sort of High Church Anglo-Catholic one, the Reformed Evangelical College, and then there's Cuddesdon, where I ended up going, which kind of bills itself as a kind of big tent, and my experience there was very much like that. We'd have benediction, creative worship was benediction one week, and it was praise songs and arms in the air the next, and there was a real mix of different traditions and styles there, and it was a large college as well. There were about 70 full-time ordinands, and then about the same amount of part-time, and their families all living on site. So it was a big community, and part of the reason I was drawn to it was because I saw it as a kind of a bit of a microcosm of the church, a bit of a microcosm certainly of the Church of England, and thought it would be the best context in which to kind of experience that breadth. it was there too that, again, I was able to do some placements in some different contexts, and experienced one major placement at a charismatic church just out of Oxford, and experienced something of that tradition, which I hadn't really understood much of within an Anglican context. Hadn't really, I don't think is particularly strong, or wasn't at the time in Melbourne, certainly, a kind of more charismatic evangelical approach. So that was certainly an eye opener for me. And then a couple of other placements in again some more some fairly modern Catholic and again perhaps more traditional Anglo-Catholic churches. The breadth there being perhaps more based around the context of where they were, and other factors rather than old sort of party labels. So that's kind of basically been my kind of formation in different traditions. It's been fairly weighted in to one side, and I don't I must say I don't sort of identify as a broad churchman. I don't necessarily, that's not necessarily where I would sort of place myself, but certainly have had some appreciation and experience of the breadth of what Anglicanism is.
Thanks, Alex. I really resonate with all of your descriptions of what it looks like and what it's been to be part of those experiences and the shifts and changes. Certainly, Alex, your last description for me is very strong, coming from Australia, moving to the UK, suddenly expanding from this very small congregationalist model of church where it was all about the local and what you got out of it, what you got out of this, but going over to the UK and seeing a breadth of the church from choral evensong at the cathedral, and then midweek Bible studies, which were, to me as a young teenager, absolutely poles apart, followed up by summer Soul Survivor events. The Soul Survivor was a big thing in the UK when I was over there. But I'm interested, while there's there's such a breadth of liturgical expression of what we may see as the things that we do in church, it's often said that there's a disconnect between what we do in church and who we are as Christians. And so I'm interested in your reflections on what implications do these forms of spirituality, what implications do these forms of liturgy and the breadth therein, what implications do they have for us as members of the church, and indeed for people in the pews as Christians, as those who are seeking to follow after Christ, and what are the great benefits, and even to be more controversial, what are some of the disadvantages that we have on view here? What are the things that you wish we could change? What are the things that you wish we could amplify more? I might go through our same pattern again. So Peter, do you want to kick us off on the round robin? We might then also be able to respond to each other a bit too.
Yeah, well, if I was to reflect on, the church experience growing up at St. James, that sort of one of the things about it was that it was very much a family-driven church, and the lay people were given a lot of influence and opportunities to serve and do ministry. And so one of the great strengths of that was that I think I was able to grow up, and all the other kids were able to grow up with a really strong community of people discipling each other. And that meant that when we became young adults, a lot of my friends remained Christians, and some of them went on to be in paid ministry as well, vocational ministry as well. Whereas it didn't attract a lot of young people, but there were definitely young people there. But then when I went to St. Hilary's, it was kind of a different type of evangelicalism, which very much attracted lots of young people. there was I remember there was a separate Sunday school for every age group. Like there was a 5-year-old Sunday school, a 6-year-old Sunday school, all the way up to year 8s, I think. And so, and then same with the youth ministry. At its peak, there were a couple of hundred teenagers there and a couple of hundred young adults there. And the strength of that, of course, is, it's attracting young people to a church denomination that's not known for young people, for whose average age is, in the late 60s or early 70s. So it bucks the trend. When we graphed the age spread of St Hilary's in the 2000s, very much it was the opposite shape to the rest of the Anglican Church. But I guess, if I was to reflect on the weaknesses back then of that model of church and discipleship and ministry, I think perhaps we weren't so good at setting up people for the long term, that once teenagers grew up and became adults and got busy with life and work and the complexities of life, maybe they weren't set up as well as they could have been for the long term to stay as Christians. And that, that's something I don't think was unique to St Hilary's. I think a lot of churches were in that sort of style and model from other denominations as well, reflect on that period of youth ministry and young adults ministry from the 2000s and what did we do wrong there. And I do think there's a lot of corrections that have been made about that. Like, we were very good at getting people in, but not as good at getting people established for the long haul of the faith journey. And I guess now in the church plant land that I'm in, I've kind of moved a little bit away from that age-based ministry of dicing people up into different ages for the different congregations, and I'm trying to keep people together, as in all ages and backgrounds, and I think that's a much richer approach. But we're not going to see the big numbers, I don't think, that I did when I was at St Hilary's, because just of the nature of the ministry and how there are things you can do to attract big numbers, and I know those tricks, and I'm not necessarily against them. I think there are time and place for that. But so there are strengths and weaknesses to both approaches, and you kind of have to make a call when you're a church leader of what approach am I going to make, and what am I going to sacrifice, but what gains am I going to make with this approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, one of the biggest juggling acts. Heather, do you want to reflect on your experience?
Sure. My internet just cut out again momentarily there. It seems to have bad days when the weather's a little cloudy, I've noticed. So sorry. But if I drop out, I'll come back.
That's okay. I think that's just like the rest of us in lockdown.
Yeah, that also goes for my mental state. So if I drop out, I'll come back. So Peter's not going to be employing a generations pastor in his congregation. I love that. What I'm building with my research, which I didn't explain very well before at the moment, is a peace building school that's ecumenical. And I've been dipping into peace education. And I think that underneath liturgical tradition and expression are much deeper issues and much deeper questions. And they're much more personal, because they really go to the heart of our identity, who we understand ourselves to be in Christ, who we understand ourselves to be in terms of our calling or our vocational life, and how we are positioned within the body of Christ, and how we understand what we understand church to be, and our sense of belonging and connectedness to church community. So I think that across the history of the church, with different liturgical expressions and ecclesial structures and the different splits and fractures that have happened throughout history, it is kind of like it's relationship separation is what sits underneath those surface, they're not surface things, but I guess those tangibles, and relationship separations that have happened over reasons why people feel I cannot express my identity safely or holistically in this space or in this way, or I do not, I in conscience do not believe this is a faithful expression of church. And so I think we're talking about very serious, very heavy, very complex and deeply personal things actually when we talk about traditions. And I think that was to begin to understand and explore what has shaped people connecting with one expression or the other, and what's really sitting underneath it, and begin to connect with that deeper experience of, well, this is what I understand about God, and this is what I understand about church, and this is why we do it this way. And I genuinely believe that there is truth and beauty across the spectrum. And there is also, I think, a tendency to overcorrect in us as human beings when there's a painful experience, which corporately, you know, there is. I mean, the Reformation, let's say, is one, or you know, the splits that happen within denominational structures, which are over identity and are over our sense of worth and who we are in Christ. So I think
Hopefully Heather will be back with us.
I genuinely believe that we overcorrect when we're wounded level, but it does happen on a corporate level, and sometimes it's happening at a subconscious level. We're not even conscious that we're reacting to woundings that have happened generationally or corporately to the people that we're connected with, or to the family that we come from, or the culture that we come from. And so we throw the baby out with the bathwater. We all do it. And I think that's the challenge. And I think the Anglican Church is really well positioned to address that.
Thanks, Heather. And I agree. I think often we end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater because these areas seem to be so separate. The dichotomies seem to be so distinct and so stark. And some of the questions that have been coming in actually address some of these. And we'll have a time for questions at the end. Do message me questions as in the chat box. I've got some coming in now. Alex, do you want to reflect on those things though?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I certainly would echo Heather's comments that there's a whole lot that's beneath different liturgical expressions. There's a whole lot that goes much deeper. And in a sense, it's kind of interesting that we're talking about liturgical breadth as a lens to look at breadth within Anglicanism, because you know, Anglicanism, for the most part of its existence, has kind of been characterized by a kind of liturgical conformity. It's only been really in the 20th century that this kind of breadth has been made kind of possible, and really that was through some pretty hard fought battles in the 19th century. You know, people went to jail for lighting candles, you know, that sort of thing. And so it's a bit of a fiction to think that there's been this sort of long, uninterrupted kind of breadth of liturgical practice, when quite the opposite, in fact, has been the case. But nevertheless, you know, that's kind of where we are. So how can that impact? You know, how can we draw from different expressions? And I guess perhaps more than a broad church, perhaps a receptive church. You know, a church that is willing to receive from other traditions within it. I mean, receptive ecumenism is where I use that term from. It's an ecumenical term, which is all the rage at the moment, but within a church like Anglicanism, which has quite distinct expressions and groupings, I think it's an idea that could have some currency as well. You know, how do what can we learn from and take from other experiences? But one thing that perhaps might be lost, I wonder, is that the sense, you know, we talk about the impact of this breadth on our spirituality. One thing perhaps is lost is a sense of common prayer in in our life together. It used to be the case that clergy were bound to pray the morning and evening offices by law. Certainly in England, it still is, and it's not that they're bound to pray to any form of prayer. There's a particular set form of prayer that they're bound to, and this kind of generates a sense of corporate identity, a sense of corporate prayer together, and that's something that perhaps is lost in this breadth. But certainly too, there would be aspects of different spiritualities which might commend themselves to others. But ultimately, too, they do, as Heather mentioned, they speak of something much deeper. So, a key point in Catholic spirituality is a reverence for and devotion to the sacrament and Christ in the sacrament. Now, that presupposes some doctrinal things, and you can't gloss over that, and it's at that level that there really is a kind of enduring and often conflicting breadth within the Anglican tradition, and we shouldn't, I think, shy away from that. It would be impossible. A broad church which doesn't have any of that variety contesting within it is simply an empty church. That's what a big tent is if you don't put anything into it. So a broad church on its own is really not an end in itself.
I can speak as someone who's organised and done sound and lighting for large festivals. There is nowhere more lonely than being in a big top with no one in there. It is absolutely dismal, especially at the end of a set or end of a gig. There's no one there, and you're all on your own, and you feel that loneliness. We're picking up on some of the questions that are coming in, and we'll come back to that question of corporate identity, I think, because I think that's one of the really big ones. But the first thing I wanted to address and think about then is one of the great benefits that Anglicanism has is structure, and we have that in spades. Often people, when it gets time for synod, people think that we have too much structure, too much governance to go around. But as one of the questions has come in, do we need to be giving up some of that structure? Are we overly structured in those ways? Do we need to think outside of the box, outside of what has been questioned as the so-called quote so-called low-high progressive traditionalist divides? I'm thinking about that structure, which so often both ties us together and also pulls us apart. What implications does this have for our systems, our structures? Given what we've seen in many congregational churches about the implosion of Mars Hill, for example, the abuses that have happened in those sort of environments. What are the best forms of structure that we can have to support that breadth in the church? Interested in your reflections again there. Peter, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think at the moment, at least if we think about the Australian Anglican Church as opposed to the worldwide Anglican Church, it feels like our structures are being pulled along by the demands in front of us, rather than the structures being something that we are in control of. So I'll give you an example. In my church planting space, there's become a desperate need for renewal in our diocese, in Diocese of Melbourne. There's so many church buildings now that are almost empty or are empty and emptying out, and churches having to close down, and churches not being able to find incumbents. And so there's this real desperate need for renewal. And I feel like the church planting movement, which is gaining a lot of traction and steam in Melbourne, is partly a response to this need. And so the structures of the denominational structures are having to quickly adjust and change its approaches to how we operate. So, for example, you know, in the time that Merri Creek's been operating, we've had the canon law change to accommodate church planting a lot more. We've had a bishop appointed in charge of church planting. We've had 2 canons appointed who are responsible for church planting. And it's very much on the agenda now. And we're even recruiting clergy from other denominations who are church planters, who are looking to the diocese, the Anglican Church, as a safe place to do ministry. So that's partly, I think, in response to what you referred to, the Mars Hill example. For those of you who don't know, it's become an infamous example in America of a independent, a large sort of, I guess it was called a new Reformed church in the 2000s and the early 2010s that basically went into a, you know, the leader got dismissed for bullying and abuse within the church leadership. And a lot of people look at that example as what can go wrong when you're an independent church. And I think others in Melbourne and in Australia, in the church planting movement across the world, many church planters are seeing denominations as a good option now, whereas they used to not. And so anyway, getting back to Melbourne, and what we're seeing is the denomination and the denominational leadership adjusting to accommodate this kind of push, as opposed to us sitting down and thinking, how can we position ourselves for the future and anticipating the pressures that are going to be put on us, you know, with the changes in culture and the shifting that's happening in the Australian church, which is very rapid. I mean, I'll be interested to see what the new census tells us, and the NCLS data tells us about our denomination, but it's looking not very good at the moment in terms of attendance and numbers, if you just use that as a measuring stick.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to be thinking prayerfully forward, thinking forward into the future as to what the future of the church is. Heather, do you want to reflect on? Heather might be frozen. So we'll go to Alex and we'll come back to Heather.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think first to say, I think, you know, I think structures matter. They, you know, polity actually matters in the church. I think it matters to the church. I think it matters to God. And you know, the precursor to the kind of broad church movement is the Latitudinarians in the 18th century, for whom structure didn't really matter. In fact, you know, very little mattered. And it's interesting that because of that, you know, the magistrate then therefore can legislate for the structure of the church. It wouldn't really matter what it was, but it ended up in a very narrow and you know, and quite suffocating space. So I think you know, I think that structures should be agile. I absolutely agree with Pete on that. Structures should be agile, but they're not arbitrary. They're not just sort of up for change willy-nilly. What does this look like today? I mean, you mentioned the Mars Hill, kind of another parallel happening in the Church of England at the moment is the huge debate over the place of the parish, and what's really kind of being at least exposed as a kind of a disconnect between, you know, between the church planting movement and between the inherited structures, the sort of traditional parish structures of the Church of England, and you know, and this is despite what the leadership says, is more and more, you know, really exhibiting a kind of gulf of understandings of the church. So structures that are agile, but also actually do work together. So you know, there does need to be within Anglicanism, let alone kind of other things from outside the tradition to learn from, but within Anglicanism, structures need to work together. Again, that might be slow and clunky, but and there need to be found ways to release that agileness that's necessary for mission too. But I think that the sort of the crusty key limiting factors, as they've been called in the Church of England, the parish priests, they've been the ones over the last 18 months who've been burying the dead and rapidly needing to reimagine their ministry and their outreach and their mission in the light of this situation, as have we in Australia, of course, as well. But there's perhaps been a greater pastoral cost in the Church of England too. So a real kind of spirit of partnership in attending to those structures is I think, critical.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that you've picked up there, Alex, in terms of structure is that there's been this great shift back towards structures in a time of pandemic where we haven't had the structures to be able to rely on. So I note that several evangelical churches here in Melbourne, including the one that I served at before coming to Trinity, have moved to to saying the daily office or another form of morning and evening prayer, which wasn't their usual practice. It's become something that is engaging in that. Heather, do you want to continue now that your internet's back?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I think it's all about relationships. I think that it's not a coincidence that we talked about Mars Hill briefly, and the issue of abuse was mentioned there, because what is the structure? At the end of the day, a structure isn't just a mechanism that exists outside of relationship. It's about how we relate to each other and the relationship structures that we set up to do life together as a church. And I think that, like any family, you do need consistency and corporate identity and uniformity, and you also need freedom for individual expression within that system. So you absolutely need both. And when there is a breakdown of one or the other, it's usually because of an abuse of power and because there isn't trust in relationship. So I think, yes, I wish we had more shared identity in terms of the way that we prayed and the way that we had a sense of corporate connection in our prayer life and the way that we minister the sacraments. But I think the deeper issue behind why we don't is that there is broken trust with church authority across our denomination and across the body of Christ. And that's the deeper issue that we need to address. People don't feel connected corporately because of broken trust. That would be my view of it.
I also wonder whether one of the trends that at least we're seeing in Melbourne around where there is church growth is that, as I mentioned earlier, people coming across from other denominations. So even now we're getting people going through the ordination pathway that grew up in one denomination and quickly have jumped across to become Anglican clergy and don't have an appreciation or an understanding even of the structures and of and sort of see it more as a means to an end. If I do these things and tick the right boxes, I'll be able to operate under this tent, and so it's a challenge that we have in front of us, I think, as the Anglican Church, is how we work out how to communicate 21st century Anglicanism to our new leaders and our congregation members. I mean, I know in my own church, even though I talk about Anglicanism a lot, there are people who are from Pentecostal backgrounds and from Baptist backgrounds, Churches of Christ and Roman Catholic backgrounds, and don't really, even though I talk about it a lot, don't really have an appreciation or care for Anglicanism, but they love their local church, And there are other churches within our diocese that are even more the case. That's even more the case in mine. So yeah, it's a challenge for us, I'm sure. But from both what Alex and Heather have said, maybe this is a trend across the world in our denomination.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There's such an increased fluidity between Protestant and non-Catholic church denominations in terms of ordained ministry. People are just fluidly moving into roles across denominations more and more, I've noticed. And there seems to be a strength in that, but I think there's also a danger in it. And I think you're absolutely right. And one thing I think we've lost in a lot of evangelical Anglican churches is just a shared sense of why we actually meet on a Sunday.
I wonder if that brings us then to the crux of the issue, which is the one that has been streaming in on all the questions. The number of questions I've had revolving around what is the identity of the Anglican Church. So what, to summarize it, what holds us together, what identity structure holds us together in the diversity that we have? How do we manage the broad church? How do we manage the tent in which we find ourselves a part of? I wonder if we could have a brief reflection there, and I'll throw it to Bob to round us out.
I'd say I find this question a very difficult one to answer with confidence. Yeah, not that I don't think about it. Yeah, I mean, I feel like you could observe the cultural identity that we have, and there's something about the background of the people that are drawn to the Anglican denomination, which, you know, you have to do some generalizing here, but there's something about the type of education backgrounds that people seem to have, the demographics seem to be from a different kind of, I guess, a middle class background. But I don't, yeah, that when I talk to people from, say, other denominations, I'm involved in a leadership program called Arrow, which Heather's been part of, that has people from all different denominations across Australia. And you do notice demographic differences in denominations. People coming through completely different pathways. You know, when I talk to a lot of clergy, they seem to have been in Melbourne, had very similar backgrounds. Whereas if I talk to Pentecostal pastors, you know, many of them have just had no education at all, or very minimal education, being brought up, you know, that maybe their dad's the pastor and they're taking over the family business, you know, it's that sort of thing. So there's something about the cultural our cultural backgrounds that unite us together. But I don't know, I'm sure Alex has got, and Heather's got more profound things to say.
I think you're right, Peter. I mean, it's a contested identity. I think you know, that has to just be said, that Anglicanism is essentially a contested identity, and there are some who would locate its identity in its you know, in the English Reformation, and in its Protestant character, and in confessional statements, and there are some who would you know, locate its identity in this basis of its authority in its apostolic character, perhaps, or its or indeed, you know, in its kind of national mission, and thrown into that too, there are a whole lot of cultural factors which you know, which impact its identity. So you know, it's Anglicanism means English. You know, it does have a certain kind of English identity to it. And yeah, I remember going to the Thai-Burma border, and in the little church, and in a Malay refugee camp, and the prayer book was in Burmese, but it was a word-for-word translation of the Book of Common Prayer. You know, it was sort of kind of transplanted from a completely different context, and yet we see more and more a kind of contextualization of Anglicanism, and a commitment to you know, Anglicanism being perhaps the you know, in some way a kind of national expression, or a sort of cultural expression of the place in which it's set, and so all of these things are kind of pulling in sometimes different directions, and sometimes they give some sense of what what our identity is. I think one thing about Anglicanism that I think is, and Pete's mentioned this, is that it doesn't exist to serve itself. Anglicanism doesn't sort of claim any exclusive authority as the church, and I don't think it'll just be Anglicans in heaven. Anglican has a certain provisionality about it, which simply sees itself as the Church of God in a place. Now, in increasingly, in a context in which denomination is less identified with, that has positives, but it also has, it also means that Anglicanism needs to kind of do a bit more soul searching to articulate its distinctiveness, and I guess the question is whether you find that distinctiveness ultimately in some kind of neutral common ground, or whether we kind of engage in the battle for ideas about the battle really for vision of what the church is to be. It's probably the latter of that in a constructive and a receptive and a respectful way, which I think has more to commend it, and ultimately I think is also where we might rebuild some of that trust, which Heather raised too. It's absolutely true that trust is a huge stumbling block for us, not least in this diocese here in Melbourne. But trust is built through honesty, I think, not through papering over cracks.
Absolutely. And thank you so much to all of you for both attending and being able to think about these sort of things. And thanks to our three panelists for your wonderful participation. Unfortunately, we have reached time. I know Bob wants to jump on and give a last word, but let me just say thank you so much for everyone for attending. And I'm sure that we could spend the next, however, probably years talking about these things. And so I would leave you with that exhortation to talk about them well, not just to be papering over cracks. So let me throw to Bob.
Thanks very much, Chris. And please join me in thanking our panelists, Peter, Heather, and Alex. And you can do so with your reaction buttons and the chat function on Zoom. So thank you very much for a very stimulating lunch hour. I really appreciate it. Just to let everybody know before you sign off, some of our upcoming events. Our next lunchtime Zoom seminar will be on the 27th of October, which is a Wednesday, again at noon. And the topic will be thinking theologically about religious enmity. And Dr. Scott Kirkland will be hosting a panel discussion on that date. So please mark that down in your calendars. Also, just to let you know, our final continuing education event for the year will be on Year C, the readings for Year C, which starts in earnest on the first Sunday of Advent at the end of November. And our speakers will be yours truly and Dr. Rochelle Gilmore. For more information on both of these events, please visit our website. And as well, if you want to learn more, if you're interested in theological study, please visit our website and attend our virtual open house, and let us know if you have any questions or comments at tcts@trinity.edu.au. So thank you all for coming. It was great to see you all today. Hope you're faring well in this lockdown, and I wish you all the best. God bless. Thank you.